Is there a doctor in the house?
Doctor, you have a visitor in the main lobby.
Hello and welcome to the Talk To The Doc podcast, where we dig into the habits, disciplines, and mindset shifts that kind of turn everyday leadership into hopefully extraordinary results. Today, we're exploring how high performance psychology applies not only to elite athletes, but also to leaders who want to build motivated, trusted, high performing teams. It's a conversation that blends science, strategy, and hopefully get some new truths out there you can put to work right away. I'm your host, Steve the Doctor Meek, and the doctor is in. Today I have with me Zane. Zane, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Zane Dodd. I'm a psychologist. I have a private practice, group practice actually. I founded with a partner of mine about 5 years ago. My partner, Dr. Carla Pulliam. It's the Chrysalis Center. And then though what we'll be talking about some today in the performance space, we have a performance branch or arm that is called Elevate. So
that's awesome. Now that's a little bit unique. Or do you find you've got like a lot of competition for what you do, or are you guys just very specialized?
Well, are you talking more specifically about the performance element or the broader kind of group?
Yeah, the broader group.
Yeah, well, the field, I think there's in terms of psychotherapy, there are different kinds of therapists. We are psychologists, which means that we have a doctoral degree in some form. All of us here, either clinical or counseling psychology. And we cover a pretty broad range of the populations of folks we work with. So I would say it's a relatively competitive environment. The performance piece becoming a subspecialty, there's kind of surprisingly fewer folks that are qualified to be working in that space, especially I think for the DFW area, given the percentage of sports and everything that we have going on around here. It's still a pretty small subspecialty. So
awesome. Well, I love it. One of my prior podcasts was around HR, and the speaker likened all of his HR topics to basically sports analogies and like high performance athletes and stuff. So I'm guessing there might be some similarities in the conversation today. Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I always start off my podcast, as a fake doctor in IT, I always try to take the vitals. So can you give me kind of a sense in your head, kind of what's going on, I guess, kind of the current state, the pulse of your industry?
Yeah, so I think it depends really on which groups we're talking about it. But if we're kind of orienting more towards the work I might do with, say, executives, we work with, we're here in the South Lake area. We work with a lot of folks that are founders, entrepreneurs, they're kind of drivey folks that have built things, created things. What we see a lot of, they really maps on well to a lot of the athletes that we might work with as well. Issues around kind of confidence, which is surprising. Many people come in high achievers and they feel, sometimes it's referred to as imposter syndrome. They feel like they must be very different because they're kind of doubting, when in fact reality that confidence is one that even the most elite performers, when they kind of pull gold medal winning Olympians, the one thing they say they want to improve more on is confidence, right? So we see a lot in relation to confidence, self-belief. We see a lot in relation to kind of emotional kind of wellness and regulation. It's very hard to be operating at this level of performance and to have balance is even a question. Can you really attain balance, or do you have to kind of pick your places? But to have emotional health and well-being is something that comes up a lot. There's a whole lot that comes up with just managing relationships, right? Not as much talk that, we're not necessarily doing business strategy. That's kind of the technical, tactical parts of what they do. And that's usually where their specialty is, right? Like my specialty has to do with kind of all of the kind of social and emotional components that exist around trying to be a leader or to try to kind of perform at a high level. So those are some of the major areas. They don't necessarily come in something we can talk about versatility. That's not necessarily someone comes in asking for, but we know that to be a really central component. We might talk about kind of psychological flexibility as one way it's talked about, but the ability to kind of have a deep understanding of yourself and the situation and to be able to match them up with one another. So it's an awareness and it's skills and capacities to be really versatile. Many of the environments people are operating in, be that business, be that sport, They're highly kind of unpredictable, kind of shifting, moving. The skill, the capacity to have versatility is pretty significant. So those are some of the things
Yeah.
we see quite a bit.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. As a small business owner myself, there's times where I have that feel like I'm alone on an island, kind of trying to reason through a particular issue. Or I guess I ascribe to the Disney philosophy that, yes, I'm a CEO, but I'm not really a CEO. I'm an actor playing the part of a CEO. So sometimes when I have to be more social than I really am, or
Yeah.
have to do things that are outside my wheelhouse, I feel that's part of the purview of the job. I absolutely have to do it. But I do personally get some of that imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Now, out of your research, when you talk about versatility, I heard you say skills and, kind of the psychological side. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, so there's one person's work, and again, I'm sure we can put stuff in show notes and things like that, and I'll try to,
Absolutely.
so that we don't dive way too deep, because I love this stuff, but I do want folks to have references. But there's an individual, Rob Kaiser's his name, and he's created what's called the Leadership Versatility Index. This is a 360 tool that we use.
Okay.
Unlike most 360 tools that are more kind of qualitative and that you kind of ask some question, you may have kind of personally designed it to get at the values of your organization or something like that, but they tend to be kind of qualitative. This is very quantitative, built over long periods of time, many samples, so you can also see how you're scoring in relation to others on these metrics. It's got some very interesting kind of capacities, one being most 360s are set up on like a, say, a 0 to 5 scale or something like that, with the idea being that a 5 is a really good score. One of the things they've shown is that people tend to overuse strengths. Most 5s, when they use a kind of -3 to +3 scale. So a 0 is an ideal score. What we tend to see, the data tends to show, is that people, especially under pressure, over index on strengths. And what looks like a 5 on a traditional 360 is actually kind of like, it's either a +3. They're overdoing something.
Oh, gotcha.
And so it's out of balance, right? Within that measure, they talk about the kind of the how and the what of leadership, kind of how kind of autonomy supportive versus kind of taking control one is in a given moment, a what in terms of kind of strategy and operations, these kinds of things. And they're looking at the ability for a leader to flexibly move on those scales depending on the current context. As an example, this isn't like a static thing you would want to do. Under maybe normal conditions, you would want to really drive autonomy in the group. Maybe under a really difficult time, this is kind of a crisis in the organization, you might need to kind of step into a more kind of, I say authoritarian, it sounds a bit strong, right? But you might need to be able to step in and make decisions, and it's not the time to be, right? So the ability to be really aware of the situation and have the capacity to be versatile is really important.
So is the goal out of that to shave off the top of those, hey, this is my skill, so I'm taking it up to the next level? Is it saying that, hey, maybe instead of doing that, do something slightly different?
Yeah, so I would say it's about balance,
Okay.
which I find to be, just at a kind of broad level, almost always balance is where we're going to find health, right? And in many cases, kind of productivity. I'd add to it that is not unlike, so we'd say homeostasis, right? And there's a term called allostasis that has to, when we're talking about the body, that says like these things are situational, right? Like, so your body has this capacity to kind of regulate into a nice balanced place. But for example, right, if you're about to go for a jog or a run, you're going to need to, your body has to shift, right? So you wouldn't want your heart rate at a certain level normally, but it's got to shift to meet the demands of the situation and then be able to shift back. So if you're thinking about that kind of from a psychological perspective, right, like what are the demands, the situational context and the demands for that particular leader? Are they able to meet those demands? What tends to happen, right, like I'm saying, is that under stress, whatever your kind of particular tendency is, people tend to overdo it and lack the
Gotcha.
balance, right?
Yeah, I can definitely see the importance of that. Just the nature of leadership, the nature of management is very bursty. And, whatever you're the best at, you're probably going to employ that more often, believing that that's going to get you right back on track.
Right.
So the next metric I utilize, weight, is kind of dealing with, the next metric, heart rate. I guess I kind of want to get a sense of the current state. Is there something out there that you feel is kind of a trend or something that's going on right now that would affect executives in their leadership roles?
Yeah, this is more kind of aspirational for me. I don't know if I kind of also have, to be fair, I have a population that seek me out, right? So there's
Sure.
going to be some things they see about both myself or our organization, and it's an alignment or not. It's a kind of self-selected sample in some way. So they're already probably likely seeing something they like, kind of in what we're suggesting could be helpful. But I think that we see some changes in things like an awareness about the role of kind of what some people call EQ, like kind of the
Hmm.
emotional awareness, the ability to work in that space, to understand the minds of other people, to how do you build cultures that are motivating people. We see tons of disengagement, I think, in kind of organizational work. Why is that? What's the science around motivation? I think we're operating from a model that's way outdated, so hopefully we're seeing trends where people are recognizing things that have often been kind of discounted, sadly referred to as soft skills, that they're absolutely essential in leadership. Probably now more than ever, we could dig into stuff about like what type of work that's especially important for and why things like AI, that it's especially that kind of work that we should be orienting to. And then if that's the case, how do we lead effectively? So.
Yeah, I guess I felt post COVID that, when you have a geographically dispersed workforce or a hybrid workforce and, mobility is at an all time high, that it feels to me like, emotions. There's more emotion in a typical workday. There's more emotions between people, sometimes hidden or unspoken. But I think it's kind of forced executives, people like us who are leading other people to hear, to listen. You don't always have that value of body language that you used to have being in the same room.
Yeah.
And it also kind of creates more opportunities for there to be arguments. It just kind of feels like there's been a lot more on the surface. And I think part of that, with COVID, to me, it feels like in the back of everyone's mind, there's 20% more stress that's just there all the time with the world as it is today, which means that, there's not enough room to accomplish the other stuff. So with that EQ needs, what should executives be doing to kind of bring to bear more EQ in their environment?
Yeah, let me step back a little bit. I
Okay.
think so. I would think about kind of frameworks to think about this psychology piece, right? Like
Okay.
let's call it performance psychology, because that's how we tend to think about performance, and that just goes across the spectrum. So we might work with athletes, we might work with performing artists, visual artists, musicians, chefs, executives, like people who are oriented to some kind of performance. It's their objective and their goal, right? So if we step back from that, you see and you hear a lot of talk about kind of particular tools and techniques, and those are important. We can kind of come back to what are the really popular tools and techniques used. But we're thinking more about like, well, but what purposes, what are they serving? What are we actually kind of
Sure.
building and developing? Emotional kind of capacities is one part. In the performance space, we might be thinking at a high level, depending if you want to call it overarching or undergirding, right? It's a foundation or it's kind of the umbrella over the top. We think about awareness as a meta skill, which we would differentiate into both self-awareness and situational awareness, right?
Okay.
So
Okay.
self-awareness, it's thrown around and often kind of thought about like a ticking the box like everything else. Like I took a test. I know that I'm a INTJ, and so that's my code type, and I've checked off self-awareness. I think it's a lot deeper than that, and I think beyond being kind of a thing that one kind of piece of knowledge, really it's a process, because it's an ongoing process, like the ability to be deeply aware of oneself, and that's kind of continual and hard work. You have to put the work in on that, and that has things like it's emotional, it's cognitive, like what are my thoughts, what's my thought process like. A lot of that is taking place kind of just behind our consciousness, right? We can kind of bring that into consciousness and realize, oh, these are the things I'm saying to myself consistently, right? As I'm kind of going through my day, having greater sense of kind of agency over the kinds of things we say to ourselves. It might have to do with behavioral tendencies, right? So we've got kind of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. How do I tend to respond to situations? Also, I think we see more awareness about what we call like somatic experience, which is like the awareness of the body, which is closely related to emotional stuff, but a bit different. You've got your own history, right? Like, what is my history and how I've been shaped? Because so much of that that's operating kind of outside of consciousness is shaping how you are perceiving your environment, how you are interpreting it, how you are making decisions, all that are key for leaders, right? How you're making predictions about the future. We know that there's a lot that's taking place, both cognitively, emotionally, even somatically in the body, that is influencing all that. That's not really even in our consciousness. So there's a lot of work that goes into self-awareness. Situational awareness is key too, right? Like, do I understand and am I aware of the situation that I find myself in and how to marry those two, my own kind of self-awareness and the situational awareness. So I could give you examples from sport if that's helpful, but that's a kind of basic framework. So the emotion piece, I think, is very important. I think it's been underemphasized. It's just one component that sits into this larger kind of framework for what leads and contributes to performance.
Yeah, I guess for ourselves, within our organization, we use extended disc. And so, we've kind of done the self-awareness kind of things. And, we have periodic
Yeah.
discussions where we talk about the differences between people. Back when we were all in the office, we actually had a copy of everybody's disc in front of their office or cubicle so that we could continually remind ourselves. But
Yeah.
now that we're most likely on a Teams meeting, not just ourselves, but with our clients or other vendors or other consultants or whatever, a lot of times we don't have that in front of us. So I think that we've done probably a pretty good job on the self-awareness side of things. But I think that myself and probably a lot of the audience are still feel a continual effort to work the situational side of things.
Yeah.
Are there any tips that you can provide for the situational side of things?
Well, so we use the Hogan suite. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No.
I like it. It's if we're talking kind of measures, it's a fantastic measure. There's really the suite has three components to it, which I think makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay.
The first has to do with kind of basic personality profiles. So this is based off of the big 5 personality traits, and know how familiar the audience is with that. This is the kind of leading kind of trait model theory for kind of personality. The second component, which I think is huge, which I think most measures miss out on, is what they would call derailers, which often is actually more predictive of outcome and performance than the kind of personality traits. Is what are the things individually that actually derail you? How do you tend to respond under either extreme stress or boredom? People get into trouble under boredom, right? And so these factors, like, we all have them. On average, people elevate on 4 of those scales. So we always have to kind of prepare people. You are going to have derailers. You're going to have struggles. You're going to have difficulties. What you need is the awareness about them, right? So that you could manage them and maybe grow them. And then the last part has to do with motivations and preferences and values. What are these kind of driving factors? What motivates and drives you may be very different than what motivates and drives me, right? So that to me gets at a kind of a level of complexity about the individual, I think. But there is a lot, I would just say, in working individually with leaders, there's just some hard work that goes into stuff that you don't initially realize is really influencing you. Things from your past,
Gotcha.
what you
Okay.
growing up, like what was important to you, the values in your family or culture, whatever else, or some particular thing that your personality is oriented around, be that power or ambition or competition or altruism or something that you may not feel aware. Oh gosh, that, often people are kind of saying, God, I didn't realize this was so significant in terms of what
Sure.
I'm going for or what's guiding my kind of decisions. So continual work,
Interesting.
continual work.
Continual work. Yeah. I don't know. It's probably been 15 years ago, 10 years ago, or something like that. I was excited to read this management book. I don't know if you know it, Multipliers. I think
I've
it's
heard it.
Liz Wiseman.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So she talks about how certain people in certain roles, they're multipliers, that the impact of how they interact with their team makes them do more.
Mm-hmm.
So I was all excited to read this management book. And then I realized there's a section in the book called detractors,
Mm.
and it highlights these things that are detracting functions. And
Yeah.
I'm going through it and I'm like, oops, sometimes I do that. Okay.
Yeah.
I do that sometimes. So
Yeah.
I came out of it, kind of not feeling as awesome about myself as I was going into it. But I did take away with some self-introspective concepts that, so this is why this person constantly acts this way. It's not because he's a bad person. It's
Mm-hmm.
because as his manager, I'm always doing this. And,
Sure.
I force him into that. So it was still good for me to kind of think through those things. But it was definitely an interesting read and a little bit of a different take on things,
Mm-hmm.
because so much of in the business world, so many of the books that I read are just like, hey, go do this. Hey, go do this. You're awesome. Or,
Yeah.
this is so simple kind of a thing. And, it was one of those books that kind of made me rethink about what I do. And why I do some of the things I do.
So if I can jump off of that comment a little bit,
Sure.
one of the things we talk about is mindsets, which is whereas an attitude one has might be kind of very specific and focused on something. A mindset is kind of a broader kind of lens with which you're making sense of a situation. It has a lot to do with kind of beliefs and assumptions, much of which is happening again primarily outside of consciousness. You can bring it into consciousness, right? But a lot of times
Hmm.
we have a mindset that we're not even aware that we might have in the background that is influencing things. So
Sure.
there's a few that we could talk about, but one that is, I think, really important is what we refer to as growth mindset versus a fixed mindset.
Sure.
The work of Carol Dweck, is where this is primarily coming from. Related to this is the idea of psychological safety that we could talk about, that we know from the literature is exceptionally important for kind of team performance. But the growth mindset takes these sorts of things and says, rather than like, I found this kind of fault that I have, is the recognition that like this is the opportunity for growth, right? Like this is not a fixed capacity. Like, okay, I figured out this thing. Inevitably, I'm going to have some stuff, right?
Sure.
When we identify it in the 360 or whatever the case is. So this is, it shifts, right? Like the kind of, actually people get really interested. If we can cultivate a growth mindset rather than that being kind of a threatening sort of thing to find out, this is seen as just like the next opportunity to level up, right? This is the thing. If I could grow a little bit here and grow a little bit there, I could be that much more effective or helpful or something. And it takes away a lot of the anxiety, I think, that we feel about discovering things about ourselves that we'd rather not see. If you think about an athlete, for example, it's a whole different world. You're going to be watching film, right? Like you play on Sunday and on Monday
Yeah.
you're watching film, and it's there and it may be in front of everyone, and ideally that's in a context that is not about pass and fail, but about like where we're going to grow, what's our strategy for going about doing that, right? And so really look to generate a culture of a growth mindset for leaders, but also for companies, organizations.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Just so many parallels between top executive performance and top athlete performance. You're always trying to get to that next level. You're trying to be the best that you can be at whatever your role happens to be. So moving on, the last metric, kind of more strategic. Think of weight as, it may not directly impact your health, or it does. But, sometimes that's one of the hardest battles to find. What's the strategic metric that's out there that you think that leaders should know about or think about?
I think there's many, right? These would be probably the kind of more like the tactics and the strategies that this is probably where the tools come into play in terms of what we do with folks. What the reason wavering a little bit is I just think it's highly context dependent on what that particular person needs. So for example, if we're working on emotional awareness and regulation, we might be doing things related to mindfulness, meditations to increase awareness of kind of what's going on, using redirection of the mind to kind of manage, or we might be doing what we call bottom up regulation of emotion, which is it could be breath techniques. We do a lot around kind of either kind of down regulating or up regulating the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. All of that is helping with emotional regulation. We might be doing things like visualization, particular kinds of visualization. We might be using a technique that involves kind of tensing and relaxing the body. Like there are many different kind of strategies and techniques, and it's
Oh, wow.
really about tailoring them to, okay, well, where's the particular challenge for Steve? Like, what is he working on? And then really tweaking that tool, even which particular kind of visualization we might build for you to really meet whatever the particular need is. So whether we could talk about, if you're looking for kind of examples of specific, like, you could throw one out and we could talk about different techniques if that's helpful. But
yeah, why don't we talk a little bit? Again, I do think that emotional awareness is one of those things that I think, and maybe it's more so just the speed of business and technology. We're always, everybody's emergency is our emergency, and we're always consuming tons of new information to, stay abreast of trends. Organizations are continually innovating. So, that means continually changing what's working. But, emotional awareness, I think, is probably one of the top things in my industry, and probably some of the others as well.
yeah, I think, again, I'll zoom out just a little bit and say there's so much that goes into emotional experience and awareness that I think we just don't always feel very aware of. So we might talk about some of these like as a starting point, we might call kind of like physiological kind of foundations for health. Let's just you'll hear a lot about kind of control the controllables, right? Like there's going to be a lot of things that we can't control. Let's really start by the things we can control. So these are simple, but so important. And I think probably my experience is much less appreciated kind of in the organizational space than the sports space. In the sports space, where your body is the vehicle for your performance, at this point in time, people tend to be really aware of things like their sleep and their nutrition and all of this stuff. I don't think that we're where we need to be in terms of organizational stuff, like leaders, in terms of how important that is. But let's just, for example, let's take sleep. I would refer people to some of the work of Matthew Walker, Cal Berkeley, phenomenal, and he's
Okay.
done a fantastic job of, I think his book is Why Sleep Matters. He's done a fantastic job of taking an enormous amount of literature and data and making it really approachable. But for example, there's research showing if you sleep deprive someone for, but that's not zero sleep, that's down to 4 hours of sleep. Those who've had no history of kind of anxiety or anything like that, just the day after are operating at the level of someone who has an anxiety disorder. Okay. So specifically, the part of your brain called the amygdala, that's really like the part that lights up when we have kind of fight or flight, and can really hijack the rest of our functioning, is much more reactive if we've not been sleeping. And it's just one night, right? Now, the tricky thing about sleep, as an example, is that if you sleep deprive people, again, to about 4 hours, and you ask them how they feel, the day after, they say, yeah, they're kind of feeling it, they're tired. By about the second to third day, people start telling you they're fine. We start kind of telling ourselves, and we really lose a sense of awareness about it. Despite telling you that they're totally fine, they've been sleeping good, their fine motor skills are performing at the level of someone who is intoxicated, right? Could not legally
Really?
drive. So I say all that as just one example. We could get into kind of eating, the role of eating and how that interesting research in eating, when they look at, like, so we're looking hormone levels, blood sugar, these kinds of things. Judges pre and post lunch break have significantly different rates. So like these are judges that were doing appeals, whether or not they
Okay.
approved appeals or didn't approve appeals based on whether they had eaten, right? Like serious, significant
Wow.
decisions that our nutrition is impacting, right? So when we talk about emotional regulation, there's some basic physiological stuff that people don't even tend to kind of pay attention to, that's really impacting how they're experiencing emotion to begin with. So that's just the foundation for how you get to feeling emotion, much less how you might go about regulating it.
So my appeal could have been overturned if they'd have had a Cobb salad instead of a
Yes.
chicken fried steak. Is
Yes.
that
Yes.
what I heard? Okay. All
Exactly.
right.
Yes. Yes.
That's interesting. Actually, I do have my own personal battles with sleep. Over the
Mhm.
past 2 years, I've been on kind of a personal journey of first I focused on my weight, kind of making some changes in my personal health around the weight. Then I started going to see the doctor a little bit more for like a 3-4 month period, got some wellness checks and some other things. Then I started working on mental health, kind of mindfulness walks, those kinds of
Yeah.
things. But then when I got to sleep, I just couldn't crack the barrier on sleep health. And part of it, I get up early in the mornings. Just my sleep pattern is so irregular. I stay up late a lot
Yeah.
because that's the nature of our industry. I have great ideas at 1 in the morning. And so, I make time to write them down. But
Yeah.
then maybe I get up at 5 in the morning the next day for, whatever my activity is. And I can't seem to get a good amount of sleep or stay asleep long enough. And I think part of it's just due to the irregular of my schedule.
Yeah.
If somebody's kind of going through that, are there things that they can do, like I assume many other executives are battling with, is
Yeah.
trying to find that good quality sleep as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I'm very fascinated with this area. It's not my particular area of expertise. Again, I would say someone like Matthew Walker has quite a bit in terms of what they call sleep hygiene. There's approaches like there's a cognitive behavioral therapy for CBTI, for insomnia. That basically is more like sleep hygiene stuff, checking all the boxes, doing all the things it has to do with kind of everything from blue lights to the temperature in the room. Really cool research around temperature in the room that's important, the carbon dioxide in the air. Like you can go really
Oh, wow.
at the very elite athlete level. They're doing all kinds of, they're measuring all those things in the room. You think about it, this is a real challenge for athletes as well. If they're professional athletes, these guys are, maybe they're flying, across the country. They're landing, they're switching time zones. They're in different rooms, different spaces. So there's all kinds of strategies to try to provide some consistency. We didn't talk much about this, but the performance piece is a part of what I do. A lot of my work is in the space of trauma. I work with folks that have a lot of PTSD, other kinds of things. So there's a lot of factors that come into both kind of what your mind is doing prior to sleep. The problem with sleep is you have to kind of relax into sleep. The harder you
Sure.
try to force yourself to sleep, the less likely you are. You have to kind of just set the conditions for sleep, right? And so that's part of the trouble. The more you want to be sleeping, how does one relax into sleep? Where does your mind go? And again, some of the techniques are going to be really dependent on, well, what causes your difficulty with sleep, getting to sleep, staying asleep, when you wake up. And so really tailoring that based on kind of what your particular difficulty with sleep is.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like sleep deprived, like less than 4 hours, but probably for the past 10 years, I would say that 5.5 hours of sleep a night, according to my Fitbit, is
Yeah.
kind of been my ongoing average. And I know that everything I read is around 8 to 9 solid hours every night. And I think if I have that, it's usually on a recovery day where
Yeah.
I happen to, hey, I'm so tired that I need to sleep, an extended period of time.
Yeah.
Now, I guess we've been talking a little bit about executives and athletes and performance, but when you get into conversations about high performance, specifically for executives, how do you think about that? What are you thinking about or talking about when you're getting into high performance?
We've internally kind of struggled with how we relate to the word performance even to begin with.
Okay.
And high performance, what does it mean? I think there's not a universal definition for these kinds of things. You'll see people defining it in different kinds of ways. From a kind of an attempt at an objective definition, it has a lot to do with kind of the ability to kind of execute on some kind of skill to attain some kind of outcome, right? It's about execution in elite kind of levels, and really a lot of times we're talking about the ability to execute under pressure, right? It's a highly consequential
Sure.
situation. Could be an athlete, could be a really big moment kind of for an executive. I work with a number of surgeons, right? Like these are really consequential moments, right? And how to kind of perform really well. Now, there's at least two ways to think about this. One would be kind of at an individual level. Are you talking about what may be high performance for you, may be way more than someone else or less than someone else, right? But it could be your high performance. And so you're angling for kind of what is my best. We could be talking about high performance as a relative concept, right? Like how is the performance of the organization compared to other organizations in the market, that sort of thing. So I'm going to try to orient to, if someone's coming in around performance and high performance, what is their concept of performance, right? Like, and what is it that they're kind of wanting to ideally improve upon? So, and again, are we talking at an individual contributor level theirs, or are we talking about team performance? And so that's going to be the starting point for me in terms of a discussion I'm having with someone and exploring what is high performance in their mind. What is their kind of goal? What are they shooting for?
Yeah, I guess as an executive, when I put on that, answering that question, I always think that I'm performing high at a high level. And that's not just because I'm answering emails at red lights. It's, all the different things that go along with what I do. I think I'm juggling a whole bunch of stuff. I'm doing a whole bunch of things. I'm completing tasks and those kinds of things. But when I think about high performance, and what I suspect our guests would be interested in is, how do I get my entire team at a high performing level?
Okay, so now we're shifting to team, right?
Correct.
Now, this is, kind of going back to some of the metric stuff. I hope there's a trend here. I don't know if there is, but
Okay.
my hope is, I think in organizational work, it's a massive industry for kind of executive leadership development stuff, right? It's pretty exclusively focused on the individual who is a leader. But there really is a different kind of level of analysis when we start thinking about, okay, but a leader is about, by its nature involves followership, right? Like a team.
Mm-hmm.
And how good is that leader at creating a team, right? Like not just that they're a good lead, but like that their capacity is about teamwork, right? Like how good are they at kind of motivating and driving outcome and that sort of thing. So there's some work, the research in this space around the actual team functioning is much less. I feel like there's a ton of kind of noise and not a lot of great signal. So There's a few people I really like. Again, so we can put these in the show notes, but there's a book called Teams That Work, Scott Tenenbaum and Ed Salas, and they kind of summarize all the literature that's out there, what we call meta-analyses, so studies of studies of studies, looking at, and they drill down into kind of these basic kind of factors that lead to high performing teams. And they're working across, they work with NASA, they work with, like they work with all kinds of teams in all kinds of settings
Sure.
internationally. So I really orient to their kinds of model around team functioning. And they've got an initial kind of part of the evaluation that has to do with what is the nature of your team. You talked earlier about like these really matter in terms of like it's too kind of generic to say like how do you get a better team functioning. Well, that depends so much on the nature of your team. Is your team one that is highly interdependent, where they really rely on one another, or highly independent, right? Like if you're leading a sales team and everybody's spread out and they might even be in competition with each other. Technically it's a team,
Sure.
but they're really, or is this a team that is really dependent on each other for some achieved outcome? That changes things, right? Like all kinds of things, including what you'd mentioned earlier, like are they local and people are meeting and talking in the break room, or are they very spread out? Because that's going to change how we approach this. There's a lot of factors that we have to start with there to kind of identify. Again, this is kind of the situational context. And then they have 7 primary drivers for team effectiveness.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, a lot of my energy or efforts toward that has been, just Patrick Lencioni and his work. He's got a lot of
Yeah.
team-oriented stuff. And what's the book? I just read a book my business coach recommended. Oh, The Captain's Chair, where it just talks about the power of the glue guy in high-performing sports organizations. And,
Yeah.
they were talking about sustained high performance and just having a top athlete, having a great coach. Those weren't the key those weren't the secret sauce. That it turned out it was a glue guy that kind of
Yeah.
raised everybody up and stuff. But I found those some very interesting reads. But it's just always an interest. Just as I said, the speed of my industry is very fast paced.
Yeah.
Our clients who are local government, they're hard pressed because they're doing so many different things. Our nonprofits are dealing with limited budgets and a lot of volunteers. Our SMBs are, they're struggling to find enough staff or enough of the right staff to kind of accomplish what they're doing. So it feels like everybody's trying to do way more with less than they think they should have, and trying to figure out how to get performance out of things.
Yeah, I think that the one you mentioned there that's important. There's a couple people I like in this space, but in their work and in others' work is what they'd say, you can't team away a lack of talent, right? So it is important in and of itself. Ability doesn't just get you to success, but when you lack, I mean, everybody loves that story of, the team that was the major underdog, but in reality, you need the ability on your team to be able to get there. I know something we've talked about. I think you've read the book Drive by Daniel Pink.
Correct. Daniel Pink.
And it's a nice book. He does a pretty good job of summarizing. He interviews them in the book. Richard Ryan at DC's work, what's called self-determination theory.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's been exceptionally influential in certain spaces, and yet I think it's under recognized. This is going on 50 years of really good research about what drives motivation, particularly what we call intrinsic motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're asking about how to drive high performing teams, I think the research is definitely there in this space that intrinsic motivation is kind of the gold that we should be after. As opposed to kind of compliance, which happens with extrinsic motivation in the context where you've got the sticks and the carrots making people do things. You're talking about now we're talking about commitment, where people are internally motivated to some outcome and they're just driven, right? Like they don't need to be pushed hard, right? Like, but there's a skill to helping people find their intrinsic motivation. And I think what's really important as a psychologist, we've not really talked about this at all, I'm interested in performance, but performance at the cost of well-being is not really acceptable to me.
Sure.
Right? Like, and I think that their research would show that there's three kind of basic psychological needs related to intrinsic motivation that also leads to well-being, right? So not only are we looking at increased productivity and reduced burnout and fatigue, but we're looking at much greater kind of well-being outcomes. So it's not that you have to choose one or the other. Like if you can kind of build a culture that is really like accessing these drivers, not only I think are you going to massively increase your performance, right? But you're going to increase the well-being of your people.
Is that the autonomy, mastery, and purpose?
Yeah, he calls it, so he changes it up a little bit. He calls it
Okay.
purpose, but yes, autonomy, what they call kind of competence or mastery is what he calls it. And then purpose is what they refer to as relatedness, right? So autonomy, which just quickly, people can kind of get a little wrong. They think it means independence. Autonomy is really about kind of agency and volition. So one could autonomously choose to be in relationships with someone, but it is the sense of having agency and not being controlled and forced into something. This one of all the three is exceptionally important, and you hear what we refer to as an autonomy supportive environment, and that is what he's talking about some in the book, right? Like how do we give people a sense of autonomy and the kind of balance, how to do that while still holding high standards that has to be in alignment with the organizational values and objectives, right? How do we build an autonomy? Mastery or competence is this drive for continual growth, right? Back to some of the things we talked about even earlier on in terms of a growth mindset. It can be very intrinsically rewarding to get better at things just to feel that you're becoming more competent. The danger in the research, right, is if it becomes kind of what we would call ego involved, meaning like my sense of self becomes tied to my performance and outcome. And this is across organization, this is across sport. That's when we get into trouble, right? When that's why we orient
Sure.
to process over outcome. And then relatedness is that it is about relationships with people. He calls it purpose because it's also this bigger picture kind of relationship. What we're doing is it's related to something bigger than just ourselves. Those three together, not like I said, not only drives performance, but also well-being.
Yeah, they've been in our 2 to 3 year plan now for several years. Each year we have kind of an annual priority that kind of tries to drive into a different aspect of that or implement
Yeah.
something a little bit different throughout the course of the year. But it's definitely a slippery little snake to kind of wrap your arms around and
Yeah.
hold on to, and just kind of from that old school mentality that, hey, if I just pay more people more, they'll do more.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the big takeaways from the book, that the reality of the science is that just because you pay somebody more doesn't mean there's going to be more output. And for years I think every industry kind of believed that, and
Yeah.
maybe it goes back to partially to the talent conversation or point that you made earlier.
Well, and that's one of the really counterintuitive things about their research. And when we talked about the models shifting, we could go into a lot more depth about this. Is coming from kind of a behavioral model of the 60s where you just have reinforcements and punishments, and that's what drives behavioral outcomes, and that's what it is. But they come along and show research that actually when you put these external rewards on things, you actually undermine the intrinsic thing. So you can take something, they have lots
Sure.
of studies, right? The kid who loves to do this thing, I'm still, trying to get people not to pay their kids to like score soccer goals, right? Like, because
Yeah.
what happens is they get really focused on
Yeah.
that, and then you take away the reward, and now they don't want to do it anymore, and they stop doing it, which is super tricky. And like, okay, but how are we bonusing people and rewarding people? And that's complicated because of course your compensation matters, but if we're undermining, right, like their intrinsic motivation, how do we balance those things? So it's a whole nother conversation, but I think a really important one. What are we paying for? Is it just individual stuff? Is it team stuff? And are we undermining their kind of engagement and intrinsic motivation in the way that we're doing it? And I think they've got some potential solutions for some of that.
Gotcha. And your coaching efforts in your environment, here in the DFW area, is there any one of those that stands out as helping organizations or leaders move their organization, move the needle one way or the other a little bit better, or a preferred starting point?
Do you mean of those three?
Yes.
Good question.
I just, I imagine somebody who's just getting into it. It's like, hey, I can't do all three at once, or I'm just getting started. Where do I start? For us and in our practice, a lot of times an organization has so many technology challenges or issues or areas they're trying to innovate. They can't do them all.
Yeah.
So we always try to steer them into here's the most impactful areas to start. I was just wondering, of those three, is there one area that might be a little bit better starting place or more impactful to begin with? That would be a good starting point for them.
Yeah, it's a good question. Gosh, they all feel important. You, again, to contextualize things, when you talk about innovation, we know from the research that an intrinsic motivation is much more important for things like creativity and innovation, what they call kind of heuristic work. Extrinsic motivation, where you pay people for, is much better for kind of algorithmic work. Like you're just going to how many widgets did you get off the line, right? Like,
Right.
so I would start by saying, yes, if you're doing innovation work, you're doing creativity work, you especially want to be focused on kind of intrinsic drivers. Of those three, I think autonomy is where I'd start, and how to increase. You talked about some of the trends since COVID. I think it's one of the major trends that you would see as people kind of step back and they're like, man, I work from home. Like there's a balance in, I think, a lot of this. And I think that potentially also can undermine the relatedness component, even though it feels good to not have to go to the office. I think there's something to be said about how that's impacting us. But the autonomy part is what I think people found that's really important, a greater sense of agency over their work life. Now, I think that has to be balanced with their ability to achieve the results, obviously, right? Like, so that it does not mean that you're not holding a high standard. I think part of the model in terms of leadership, whether that's coaching or executive or whatever, and our work is to look at these two dimensions of both support and standards. There's different ways of thinking about it, but you talk about being kind of an old school kind of leader might be very high on kind of standards, low on kind of the support piece. Some leaders are too high in kind of a permissive category. They've got tons of support, but they just really struggle to hold the standard, right? The skill, like what they'd call like the facilitative environment, right, is the one in which they can hold the standard and be supportive. So there's ways to do that. I would say it has a lot to do with collaboration, right? So if I'm your kind of superior, I'm not just kind of putting on you the objectives and outcomes. I really want to kind of collaborate with you so that whatever the particular outcomes are we're aiming for are in part yours as well, right? So if the time does come that we need to have a conversation about performance, I'm coming to you, not only right from a position of kind of like, oh, this is about punishment, but this is about, how do we help you reach your objectives, which are aligned with our company objectives, but that you don't feel like it was just placed on you, right? So there's a whole kind of list of things you can do to create a more autonomy supportive environment. I'd start there though. Collaboration.
Yeah, and you're right. Kind of some of the research. Not long after, I guess, like a year and a half or so after hybrid work, Microsoft did like this huge report on out of their work lab. Basically, they did a study on hybrid work and how it impacted things, and it absolutely talked about the people felt like they were getting more done because they were just doing rote work.
Yeah.
But collaboration, innovation, all those things dropped, and people got more dissatisfied working remote, even though they felt it was the right thing for them. And it was kind of a circular thing of, well, if I just went into the office a little bit more, I'd feel more connected to everything. I wouldn't feel so burnt out.
Yeah.
But they're the ones pushing to stay away from the office and work remote. So it's kind of a slippery slope. And, unfortunately, now you're seeing organizations go out there and, reverse that and forcing people back to the office. And, there's stress on both sides of the equation. And it's something we struggle with, is trying to figure out what that right blend is. But I think that every organization's got to do what's right for them. And, every person's got to do what's right for them as well.
Yeah.
Well, wow. We kind of went through a lot of stuff today, Zane. I feel kind of like, let me think of how to put this. I kind of feel like we're at the end of watching the sunrise. The light keeps showing me a little bit more than what I was first expecting. So as we kind of roll into a close, what's that single ray of sunlight? What's that big wisdom that you want our readers to take away from this? What do you want to shine on our audience?
I think that particular areas that people can focus on and work on, whether that's kind of emotional awareness or physiological control or kind of the way they think or whatever. But all of those things rest on understanding yourself and understanding what the situation is asking of you, right? So back to the basic principle around self-awareness and situational awareness. And there's no hack for that. That is putting in the work. There's a lot that goes into reflection. There's a lot that goes into seeking feedback. I can tell you that the data sadly would show that people in lots of industries, people rate themselves much higher than they end up being rated. We all
Sure.
have a bias to see ourselves in kind of more flattering light, but that can hold us back. If we can be really open and actually seek out, kind of crave kind of this growth, we kind of need to know where we need to grow. So the self-awareness, there are tools and techniques for mindfulness, but also really important conversations with trusted people that can give you feedback. Maybe that's other people, maybe it's a 360 tool, but maybe it's people that and you trust, mentors, or the space that we work in, right? Where you're working with kind of a therapist or a coach of some sort. I would strongly encourage people to invest in a continual process of kind of self-awareness and situational awareness.
So in the same way that your top athletes are in the gym away from games and what's going on, executives need to also be in their gym of making themselves better and do those kind of things aside from the day-to-day work.
Absolutely.
What also ask for prescriptions. I'm sure you know about prescriptions, but are there any books or tools or podcasts that you'd recommend for the audience that just jump right out at you?
Yeah. So as far as the teamwork, like I said, the book Teams That Work, I really like that book. There's another person named Gordon Curfey. I believe his book is called Ignition. They have a kind of what's called the rocket model. And his is another one. They have a tool as well that they've developed, a quantitative tool that I think is really nice this is for team oriented stuff. I mentioned Rob Kaiser's work for the Leadership Versatility Index. A lot of these have been connected and kind of come up through the Hogan system. The Hogan personality suite, I think, is really like the research and work there. So those are some very kind of specific to kind of organizational stuff. I enjoy as far as podcasts, I often listen to, there's a performance psychologist, Michael Gervais, his podcast called Finding Mastery. Really enjoy it. He's worked at kind of elite levels in sport, but also he works with Microsoft. He's worked with Red Bull. He works with across different disciplines, which is, I'm drawn to that sort of work, seeing the commonalities across. And he interviews all kinds of people from all walks of life, so if your folks are interested in that sort of thing, I'm sure they'd be interested in some of his work as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Some great recommendations. Well, Dr. Dodd, thanks so much for sharing today. I feel like not only did I come away with some things to think about and keep working on, but I believe that our audience also has some great takeaways and things that they can do themselves. Now, if somebody wanted to reach out to you and engage you outside of the podcast, what would you recommend? What and the how?
Yeah, so we have a website, both it's called the Chrysalis Center. It's thechrysaliscenter.com. And then, like I said, we have a performance kind of branch or arm of it's called Elevate. Websites for both of those with our emails and such on there. And so there's appointment requests on the website and the pages, so people could call, they could email, they could fill out the request on the websites. Any of those ways will get back to me. So
okay, awesome. We'll make sure and track those down and have all those for the show notes. And if you want to reach out to me, spelled out the doctor at fulcrumgroup.net. Wow. That brings us to the end of our doctor's appointment. I think that our conversation today kind of reminded us that high performance, it's not just for athletes. It's an actual discipline. Every leader can apply in their organization. And I think it helps us build, trust, motivation, and helps us recharge our batteries and helps us build stronger teams. So if this episode resonated with you, please make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. And don't hesitate to share it with someone who you feel could get a fresh perspective on leadership. I'm your host, Steve the Dr. Meek. Thanks to Dr. Doc. And hey, the doctor is out. See you next time. Thanks for stopping by today.